So our guest today is Father Andrew Coleman of the Church of England. And would you like to say a few things about yourself, a little bit about how you came to be interested in Norse myth and which what you're looking to talk about today?
Yeah, I came to be interested in Norse myth because of this book. I don't know if you've ever read it. Norse
Oh yeah, very popular.
Myth. Yeah, and I when I was growing up, a teenager and all, I'll level with you. I spent more time reading this than I spent reading the Bible. I did. Don't tell the bishop. But that's what I did, and I just loved it, and I've always loved it ever since. And I noticed that I'm not the only person to be like that. Like C.S. Lewis, is,
Hmm.
before he became a Christian, he heard about the death of Balder, and that really led into a spiritual awakening. And I was going to church and everything anyway, along with reading the myths. And yeah, I ended up, after doing various things, I did the Masters of Divinity at Melbourne College of Divinity, and I was ordained priest in the Church of England in 2008. Church of England, it's what the Queen and the Archbishop of Canterbury are in. I was ordained in Australia, and I've been over here since 2013. I've got an urban church in Coventry, and I also minister in two villages in North Warwickshire. And they're medieval churches. So they're stunningly beautiful, Shilton and Anstey.
Yeah, when you had sent your bio at first, I was kind of looking over the Google Maps, trying to find them. Very pretty over there, actually.
Yeah. They're stunning. They're stunning. And above in Shilton Church, you can see the structure on the wall where the rood screen beam used to be before the Reformation. And above it, I was sitting there in church one day. So there was a beam, there was a crucifix before the Reformation there. I was sitting there in church one day and look up at the roof, and I got amazed. There was sort of like, I think it's called a green man,
Hmm.
and it's sort of like this. It's carved into the roof, and it's like a man's face, only with leaves coming out of the
Huh.
mouth. I was kind of, sort of coming a bit of a shock. I don't know, why am I telling you this? Because I went to Southall Minster, and in the chapter house, they've got them carved all in the walls. And I'm like, wow. And I was thinking, am I in a pagan temple? Am I? Do you know what I mean? Did I miss a memo? But I think it just shows how open the medieval church has been to
Hmm.
co-opting ideas from other religions. Although I'm not even sure that we have, maybe people listening might know, I don't know if we even have any green men recorded from um, non-Christian authorities. It might have been something that the church, medieval church, just made up as a fun thing of a symbol of life. Because they're pretty out there that way, I think.
And Stella has a link there on the side for anyone who wants to look at some of the history of the Green Man motif. And by the way, actually, I have a similar anecdote. It's interesting how sometimes early on in the missionary phase of the church, it's actually, and that can be several centuries long. It can be a little bit more permeable to some of the stories of the culture that is being converted. Um,
Yeah.
when I was in grad school, I had a girlfriend from Madagascar for a long time, and I was really interested to hear about. I never went to Madagascar, but I was really interested to hear about how the traditional pre-Christian Malagasy funeral rites were still conducted, and they are incredibly different from any sort of Christian funeral rites. I mean, there's a lot of there's like I don't want to act like I know all about this because I really don't. But as I recall, there's like annual handling of the physical bones and bodies of
Mm.
of ancestors and things like that. But this has all been sort of incorporated. And then in Wyoming on the Wind River Reservation, there is a church where the services are given in English and Arapaho, but where, for example, the altar is composed entirely of American Indian motifs, like drums and eagles and such, and you have the
Really?
Passion of the Christ rendered in an American Indian style, with all of the roles, with American Indians in all of the roles. So it's interesting sometimes how the church can really be it allows itself a certain adaptability to the
Yeah.
circumstances of the people. And I'm sure something like that happened in the pre-Christian period in Northern Europe.
Yeah, 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 completely, completely. I mean, the fact that in Shilton and Ants churchyards, they've got yew trees, for instance. Now, were the yew trees already there, these ancient yew trees, or did the church think, the yew trees, they're great symbols of life and death, with the branches going into the ground and rising up again, and the fact they're all poisonous, but they're evergreen, so death and life. Did they embrace that and put them there around the churches? I suspect they did, as a symbol of life and death, and that I think the people before them were doing that as well. And I wonder if in some churches they built the church on a former pagan holy place where there were already yew trees, maybe.
Yeah, that's often been suspected. And in fact, that's probably one of the reasons why there's not more known about the physical remnants of the temple at Uppsala, Sweden, is because
Oh.
it seems like the church was built on top of it, and how do you
Um,
just it's hard to go through the church. Um, but I think also, and maybe you have some thoughts about this. And by the way, everybody, feel free to throw in your questions and remarks here. Um, I wonder how you know. I feel like often in the Middle Ages, and sometimes in other places where we see cultures again, kind of making that initial step in conversion, where that line between Christian and non-Christian is drawn, and if it's somewhere that would be a little bit unfamiliar to people in the modern West, right? I wonder if something like the yew tree, that symbolism doesn't have to be pagan,
no, no.
right? So even though there's not, perhaps a biblical source for the yew tree symbolism, I can't think of any.
No.
It can still be incorporated into a Christian way of thinking. Um, Even if the original thoughts about what that symbolism were done by someone who had never heard of Christianity.
Absolutely, and I really enjoyed your video on that amulet, which had Christian imagery and a Lee High Thor
Mm-hmm.
prayer. I was thinking, well, thinking about with the conversion to Christianity, say in Iceland and elsewhere, and I was thinking, well, like maybe because I keep thinking, is Christian influence really that bad? Really? No, I mean, don't hate me, people, but really, because I was thinking, well, the impression can be that the church came along and was like, right, hi, we're here, you're all going to be Christian now, and they're like, oh no. But I wonder if for a lot of people, they were thinking, well, this seems to be where the power lies.
Right.
And so we've been worshipping Odin and Thor because they're where the power lies. Let's also start worshipping the Christian God because that seems to make sense. So, I mean, I've been thinking about whether like it's it's not such a they back then didn't see it as quite the dramatic change that we might now. They may have seen converting to Christianity as sort of like a new development or a continuation in a way of what they're already doing. Although there are differences, we don't usually at the summit fate sacrifice people by hanging. I mean, sometimes, yeah, but not
Right.
often. So yeah.
But I think this actually, if I can make a deep cut American history analogy here, we sometimes when you live through these big shifts, they don't seem like big shifts, right? They only seem like big shifts when you look back. One that I think about is, the U.S. has typically had a two-party system. What those two parties are is kind of varied. But if you look at the 1856 election, for the first time, it's Republicans versus Democrats. It's a Republican Party, so-called, versus Democratic Party, so-called, which has been the norm ever since. Before that, it wasn't. But at the time, you would have said, well, the Whig Party is kind of fallen apart. It's kind of turned into this Republican Party. It's kind of different. Um, it wouldn't necessarily seem that different. You wouldn't have known that this was setting the stage for what every election was going to be like every 4 years for the next 170 years.
Yeah.
I think in the same way, and one point that I'm always emphasizing to people is that the pre-Christian religion in Northern Europe and in many other places was a lot more open. There wasn't this closed set of gods. You don't have to worship just this set. And if someone can demonstrate to you that another god of whatever origin is powerful, then you're potentially going to be open to cultivating favor with that god. And if eventually you are persuaded that you need to exclusively worship that god, that might not be an instantaneous process. And amulets like the one I discussed are actually a pretty good example of that. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned about Christian influence. On the internet, those two words, like in discussions of Norse myth, have become just this boogeyman. And so I've started playing like scary movie music whenever I say those words. It's like, to me, it's like saying, there's Persian influences on my cooking. Like human societies influence one another. It's not that. It's not a black and white thing.
I bought a book recently called Ancient Israelite Literature in its Cultural Context.
Huh.
A survey of parallels between biblical and ancient Near Eastern texts. It's by John Walton. What it does is it looks at, Babylonian and Assyrian religions, and it compares and contrasts with the Bible. And so, like the god Baal flew around on a cloud, a bit like Monkey in Monkey Magic, the telly show. And I was reading the book of Isaiah the other day, and the Lord God says, I shall fly unto Egypt on a cloud. And Daniel has a vision of the Son of Man descending from the Father on a cloud. And this book is saying, well, they're getting that from neighboring religions. And you think, well, why are they using what's used in neighboring religions? Well, they like cherry pick. This book is arguing that they're cherry picking images that everybody knows around them to express something, and they're incorporating them to help them get the message across. So they're not bothered that they're using something that a pagan religion uses, because it helps them to get the message across to a wider audience of who they're talking about, of who they think the Lord is.
Sure.
So, wow.
Well, and during the exile, too, there was a lot of influence, very direct, from the, sort of proto-cosmopolitan Assyrian, Babylonian society. And by the way, this is a great book if anyone is interested in Ugaritic Canaanite religion, which is kind of like, it's so close to the Old Testament, but so different, right? It's almost like polytheistic versions of a lot of the stories in the Old Testament. The book is just called Stories from Ancient Canaan, translated by some scholars of Canaanite, and I can't remember their names, and that book is at somebody else's cabin. So this is I think this kind of ties into a question I'm seeing over here, and actually I think it's a fairly difficult kind of question to handle, where D asks about Christian beliefs we can directly trace to Norse pagan rites. I think part of why that's difficult is, of course, canonically, Christianity has its roots in the Bible, which has nothing whatsoever to do with Norse paganism. Where you might see some influence going from, Norse pre-Christian belief to Christian practice is in practice, not belief, and you would expect that really just in Northern Europe. Can you think of anything? Because I think what a lot of people want to see is stuff like Christmas celebrations. Can you think of anything like that?
Uh, in within Norse religion, with Norse pagan religion, about that's really been influenced by Christianity.
Well, or vice versa. So,
Oh, like Norse influence on what we do.
yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, even with Christmas, I mean, the people in Northern Europe weren't the only people to be doing things at Christmas. I think that that's a bit like the yew trees, really, that,
Hmm.
you know, everybody's always going to be seeing the winter solstice as a big turning point, and a time for celebrating. And I also, and we can say, oh, well, the Bible never says that Jesus was born on the 25th of December, but I don't think Christians have cared about that because of the symbolism, because of the time represents the change, the beginning of light coming back into the world.
Hmm.
So no, I can't think of anything in Christianity that's been directly influenced by uh, Norse religion, unless it's yew trees or putting green men all over your church.
Yeah, I think also that there's a timeline issue here, right? I mean, if we think about when the the Bible is being written over several centuries, you have a millennium before anyone who speaks Old Norse encounters any of that. So the only influence you could expect, even on a timeline basis, is going to be very late and probably very localized. You know, um, I'm as my pretty unpopular video about how Odin isn't Santa Claus um, emphasized, I'm pretty skeptical about a lot of these claims that such and such Christmas thing goes back to pre-Christian Norse practice or belief or myth. I just think there's so many other ways to get a lot of these traditions, possibly things like the Christmas tree, go back to some sort of pre-Christian solstice practice. But again, I think we have to think about where that line is being drawn between Christian and non-Christian in a medieval context. You can do things that are not Christian in origin. That doesn't make them anti-Christian or somehow
Uh,
like excluded from the purview of Christians. Would you add something to that?
yeah, I agree with that completely. And uh, I I remember when I was a boy asking a priest. I was reading in here about Odin on the tree, sacrificing himself, and I said, "This seems really similar. What was going on here?" He said, "It's just a coincidence. Go away." And I don't think it is a coincidence, but I'm not sure that it means that there's necessarily direct Christian influence. I wonder if partly it's just that we're all human beings, and we all have a yearning for the divine, and we're all in the same basic sort of existence. So wherever we are in the world, we're probably going to come up with similar expressions of what existence is all about and what the divine might be doing. And I think Snorri sort of talks about this a bit in his prologue. He talks about the people, his ancestors, uh, not being uncared for by God, but being nourished and helped by Him. And so I think Snorri would look at Havamal and say, "Oh yeah, okay, yeah, it's similar. Maybe that's just because my ancestors were guided by the Lord God of Israel into writing this, and they didn't know that it was about." Um, they didn't know about Jesus' cross, maybe, but it was similar anyway because of this divine intervention. I think maybe Snorri, when he wrote this would have been thinking like that.
I
I,
think that that's plausible, and I think with something like the people look at Odin's hanging and Christ on the cross, and yes, you can see some interesting parallels, but I think that the parallels are largely sort of forced by the fact that they're sort of similar stories. I mean, so both are speared, but Odin's weapon is the spear. It makes sense that he would be speared by his own weapon. They both hunger and thirst, but that makes sense for someone being tortured on a wooden object. They both cry out. Again, that makes sense for someone in pain.
yeah.
Um, so I think part of what might be going on is you have two myths that actually have different sources. One is Norse, one is Mediterranean. The stories come from different places entirely. Their motifs, however, have some similarities simply by the fact that things that are happening in both stories are similar. Then perhaps you have someone writing down Havamal, right, writing down these different stanzas about Odin in the early 1200s. And perhaps what's actually the influence that you can speak of is that because the story of Christ on the cross is so prominent in his mind, a similar story about Odin rises up in his mind in a way that it might not have for someone else. Perhaps this wasn't actually that central of a myth about Odin. Havamal's the only place that myth is told, right?
Yeah.
So it may be coming up to a Christian who is influenced to think about it because of the Christian myth.
Yeah.
And again, folks, this isn't. Let me take a moment to make a disclaimer. Nothing about this conversation is meant to proselytize anyone or try to convince anyone of the truth or falsehood of any claim. I'm using the term myth to mean narrative,
Yeah.
right? So don't twist what I'm saying to me being insulting anybody's religion. Okay, so I think that's something that we neglect is that actually a lot of what the influence may be is just in similar stories, calling to mind similar stories. That was a long-winded rant.
Yeah. I think that's completely right, and but I suppose you can see what Odin does on that tree, that sacrifice. I, I suppose you can see that sort of sacrificial way of living and achieving things throughout the myths. You can see that a god will have to suffer in order to, or a human will have to suffer in order to reach a greater goal. In Anstey Church, there's a window of St. George and the Dragon, which again isn't in the Bible. But they've put it there as a symbol of, okay, I'm not going to stay in my castle. I'm actually going to go out. I'm going to confront this thing of death and darkness. And by suffering in that battle, I'm going to conquer it and thereby enter into greater glory. And I suppose that sort of idea of sacrificial living permeates all of Norse myth, and it permeates the Bible as a fundamental human understanding of how best to live.
And I think this is something that's a major difference, not between one religion and another religion, but contemporary thought and pre-contemporary thought. Is today we think of so many things as simply easy to do, right? And in our fantasies, a lot of those same things are easy to do. If you look at Star Trek, it's a world somehow without money where you can, magically manufacture food and such. If you look at pre-contemporary fantasies, they don't even conceive of food just being that easy to get. Like I always think about the Kalevala where the gods farm, right? Even in, the lushest fantasies of, say, the Bible or the Eddas, where, food is easier to get, they still talk about fields that don't have to be sown, not fields that don't have to be reaped, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's still work. People can't conceive of getting things
Yeah.
without work, right? And so I think the gods are pictured the same way. The gods have to work, right? And that can involve extreme suffering. Um, Speaking of extreme suffering, there's a question here that I don't know if I know the answer to from Nero. The Book of Job, is that an Assyrian story? I do not know that at all. Do you know?
I listened to an episode of the Naked Bible podcast with Dr. Michael Heiser, which I commend to everyone, on the date of the authorship of the Book of Job the other day, and went for 45 minutes, and the conclusion was we don't know.
Okay.
I suppose like a lot of the wasn't an Assyrian myth. Well, it's got a fire-breathing sea dragon covering one of I think, the penultimate chapter.
Yeah, I'm
So
playing my guitar.
yeah. So it's I think that's like an example of what this other book is talking about. How they can just the Bible writers can just take stuff from surrounding cultures and incorporate it in. Maybe George and the Dragon in the church window at Annecy has come originally from Marduk killing Tiamat in Babylonian myth. That same basic principle applies, that same narrative, I think, yeah. So, no, I don't.
And along similar lines, Brian asks about links between Ragnarok and the Book of Revelations, about these stories having influenced one another. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, with the Book of Revelation, I read it a while ago, and the big thing that I noticed about it is that it's a vision. I think a lot of Christians regard it as now. This is my personal view, because different Christians think different things. Some Christians think it's an actual blow by blow, actual description of what will actually happen, that there will be a dragon with actual 7 heads and everything. I noticed that it is a vision. It's totally a vision, and the Bible is full of prophetic visions, and these prophetic visions is a whole lot of amazing sort of imagery. So they do, to express something. And for instance, one of the big aspects of the Book of Revelation is a not subtle code saying the Roman Empire shall fall. This shall end, that Babylon shall be cast down. So you don't get anything about the fall of Rome in the Book of Ragnarok. In Ragnarok, but you do get a whole lot of other weird stuff in Ragnarok. And so you think, well, did the ancient Norse think that this would actually word by word happen? I mean, like when the dead giant says to Odin, "Oh yeah, Hoth is going to kill Balder," why doesn't he do something about it? Why doesn't he get rid of? Why doesn't he lock up Hoth if he's told in advance that he's going to kill Balder? Why not do something? It seems like another vision that the ancient Norse weren't possibly going to be taken completely literally, but as sort of poetry to express deeper spiritual truths. I suppose like the Bible operates by providing historical events, and it expresses other things through poetry, narratives, where they express deep spiritual truths, so deep and so strong that they're best expressed via poetry and narrative. So I suppose Ragnarok operates in a similar way to Revelation. But no, I agree with the person who's written the question that they're unbelievably similar. But again, I don't know that is necessarily entirely due to Christian influence, but maybe just this innate human sense that things die and things are reborn and changed. One of the things, I know I'm ranting, but one of the things I really like about the Book of Revelation is it does talk about how, all things are going to pass away. But it does talk about the coming of a new heaven and a new earth, and it talks about the holy city of Jerusalem descending, sort of like a spaceship, down onto the world. So it uses images of destruction, but that doesn't mean that it's saying, oh, yeah, well, the Lord's going to destroy everything and just start again. But it does use images of destruction to talk about the old, the corrupt, the darkness being driven away, and the light coming. And I think we see that idea clearly in Ragnarok, that it's not entirely fatalistic. It's not saying everything's going to end, but things are going to reborn. I liked it when that dead giant said to Odin, she said, well, you'll come into hell a second time. So he's not, going to be wiped out completely. He's just going to be in the afterlife.
Well, and I have thoughts about this too. I'll try not to go long on this. I'll say on the specifics of influence on the specific motifs of, say, volaspa. John McKinnell wrote an article, which Stella has already linked on the side, called Volaspa on the Feast of Easter, which speculated that if there is Christian influence in the specific motifs of volaspa, what it comes from is someone who had heard a traditional Easter sermon, which had some of these motifs about fire and flood and other specific aspects of the damage like that. There could potentially be some influence there. I'm kind of unsure. I'm always chary about attributing those things to outside influence. I will say that I don't think that the stories, that the broad notion of this grand finale asterisk because there's stuff after, but a big finale to history as we understand it, has to come from one place or the other, because I think that you see very different themes between Revelation and Volaspa. When I read Revelation, chapter by chapter, what I feel said between the lines is a constant refrain of, and it's your fault. Right?
Which we don't get involved for.
Which you don't get involved with, right? Revelation is so tied to human sin and failing, whereas Volaspa, you have this sense of just inevitable fate that has nothing to do with the moral quality of the people or gods. It's just an inevitable end. To me, Ragnarok is the cosmic or deific equivalent to the way that human beings have one final day that they're destined to die. This is the day when the cosmos, at least in its current incarnation, is destined to die, and the gods are destined to die. So they have their destined fate just like we do. To me, there's just a pretty simple symmetry there that seems very Norse, and especially Norse in being pretty non-moralistic in our sense, which I think is pretty different from Revelation. Now, does that mean that someone having that basic sense couldn't have heard, say, one of these Easter sermons and picked up some motifs? No, not at all. But I think that the stories have different origins in their own respective cultures.
Yeah, I like that point that you pointed out, and I suppose that's one of the big differences generally, is that in the Bible, humans are really involved with everything, and what happens spiritually and cosmically totally involves people all the time, in that they're participating in what happens in this great cosmic scheme of things. Whereas I suppose in ancient Norse literature, people don't really get it. They don't seem to be active players so much. Events happen to them that they often don't seem to be able to get out of. It's like they're running on tram tracks or something. In your translation of the Saga of the Volsungs, I love it. I had a laugh out loud moment towards the end. where one of the psycho queens, I've forgotten her name, she said, "Oh, I wouldn't get too happy because a string of good luck won't last forever." And just right at the end, do you remember the guy talking about, "Oh, really? It's just a roller coaster of disaster." In the Bible, people seem to be able to have more of an impact. It's like their part. What happens on earth isn't as divided from the workings of heaven. In the Bible, people are able to have a more active impact on what happens around them, I think. Does that sound right?
I think that's a deep spiritual difference between Christianity and pre-Christian Norse paganism. I get, the sense in the Bible that whatever our failings, the earth was made for us, and God means it for us. Whereas in the Norse cosmos, it seems that the earth is sort of here, and we were made more on kind of a lark.
Yeah.
And the gods have their purposes, and they sometimes interact with our purposes and sometimes don't. And we try to curry their favor by making sacrifices. Whereas I think in the Judeo-Christian conception, we have God's favor. We fail in a lot of ways, but ultimately we can have a certain faith that if we have faith and do good works, that things will one way or another turn out according to a good plan. I don't think there's any equivalent faith in the Norse conception of things, and that's a very different idea of faith, right? And I think that often today, modern commentators, whatever their own personal religious beliefs, are so influenced by the Judeo-Christian conception of faith and relationship with God that they transport that to pagan religions and don't see how different that relationship is.
Yeah. I can see how when the Norse people started hearing about this, how, oh wow, this is a whole new way of thinking. Oh yeah, I might have a bit of that. It sounds like this could be helpful to me. I can see them thinking that way.
Well, there's the famous story. I know that I've drugged this out here and there, but there's that famous story in Njál Saga where the missionary Thongbrandr comes to a house in Iceland, and they've got a berserker problem, and their berserker, this happens, and the berserker is impervious to fire, and so he says, well, let's set up a test. We'll set 3 fires on the floor of your house. The first one, no one will bless. That's our control fire. The next fire you bless in the name of Thor, and the last fire I'll bless in the name of Christ. And then the berserker comes in, runs through the first 2 fires without harm, and burns up in the third. And it's like, this Christ can do something, right? And that's, and that's how so many willing conversions were made. It's not saying, you're wrong, those aren't gods, I have the right God. It's, let me sell you on my God. And I think that's something that people also forget about, because we have this sort of notion that it's this again, even if you're not a Christian, if you grow up in, the UK or the US or Australia, you understand sort of contemporary Christian thought, and you kind of have the sense that, well, in Christianity, there's one God, and there's no notion that any other gods are even correct or exist whatsoever. That's not a pre-Christian pagan idea, and it's not even necessarily a medieval Christian idea, in the sense that missionaries might have thought Odin and Thor were beings.
Yes.
Right? They just weren't. It was improper to call them gods.
Yes, so St. Paul he says, don't offer sacrifices to demons all the time. So people like St. Paul would be, oh yeah, there's plenty of entities, supernatural entities around in addition to God, but they're not gods. And so he could, like a Christian missionary could turn up at a Norse altar and say, oh, they're worshipping a demon here. So they could say, oh yeah, it exists. They call it Thor or whatever. Right. It's a real thing, but it's just a rogue spiritual entity. Right. So, however...
Like when St. Olaf chops up the idols of the gods in a temple in Norway, there's actual beings within them.
Oh, really?
And in fact, it turns out that they're not physical beings, that there's like rats and stuff inside that have been eating the food offered to them. It's all full of a lot of symbolism. But there's also
Yeah.
the story in the story of Ogmund Dit, where the guy Gunnar wrestles with the idol of Freyr. He's a Christian, but he's wrestling with like this devil that sort of possesses the statue. Um, I can't remember all the details of that, but there's this conception, yeah, that these are real spiritual, and the word is demon, which again also has different connotations in an ancient or medieval thought than it does in
Yeah.
modern movie
Yeah.
thought. It's
Yeah.
it's not necessarily
It,
pitchforks.
no, just a rogue spiritual entity that's going around doing its things. St. Paul talks about the principalities and the
Right.
powers, and he's not just talking about human principalities and powers. He's also talking about spiritual principalities and powers, which rule over other nations. But I mean, Snorri in his prologue is able to say, well, ultimately, the Lord has always been in control, and he's had it so that people might grope towards him to try to. Well, St. Paul talks about other pagan people groping towards God, God trying to speak to them, and I can see how when the scriptures came and when they read the scriptures and they say, oh, here we go. Here, throughout the Old Testament, we get all this warrior imagery for God, of God with a sword, God with arrows, God killing the sea monsters. He's a great warrior God. And then when Jesus arrives, all of a sudden he's driving out the demons, the unclean spirits from people. It's like, wow, it's like game on. He's a great, powerful God. So I'm not surprised at something like the Isle of Lewis chess set. A powerful bishop, a bishop is a thing of power for that ancient Icelandic culture, reflective of taking a bishop into battle with you in Iceland and Britain, because this is where the power lies.
Right. Right. Over here, Marcel asks about the parallel between Christ and who we were talking about, and asks if there are similar stories in other cultures. The one that comes to mind for me is Prometheus, being sacrificed in a sense. I mean, he's punished because he does bring fire to humanity. Can you think of other parallels like that? I guess there's other gods that get punished one way or another. Um,
Yeah, and a lot of the ancient Christian writers had the ancient Christian writers used references to classical mythology, Greek and Roman pagan religion. For instance, was it Vetius wrote about Orpheus, maybe in the Consolation of Philosophy? He wrote about Orpheus who goes into the underworld to find his love,
hmm,
and he brings her up out from the underworld playing his harp, and like she comes up there, he looks back, so she disappears again. But it's this sense of coming up from life. I suppose things like Theseus killing the Chimera, people killing Minotaurs, Hercules sounds like Samson a lot to me, killing a lion and everything. I think it ties in with like George and the Dragon, this whole idea of the light fighting the darkness and the darkness cannot overcome it. These great wars raging, and that death doesn't have the final say over everything, and oblivion doesn't have full power over everything, but life does ultimately. And I suppose you see that in classical religion too. I just see Dee has posted about Joseph Campbell. I've never read any Joseph Campbell, but I have read a lot of Robert Graves, like the Greek myths, where he looks at the rituals behind the narratives. And he often says, oh, the myth stories, they're putting the pagan rituals into story form. He does a lot too in his book, The White Goddess. And obviously, a lot of those stories are about life overcoming death and everything. So I suppose you've got quite a lot of crossover there, similarities there.
Yeah, and I think, I'm groping toward a way to put this better, but I think that a lot of the sort of seeking for parallels and, this story and that story being sort of quote unquote the same, I think that there's not, I don't feel like it's a very fruitful direction to go in.
Yeah.
Because it's not like linguistics where you could say, this language is word and that language is word. Go back to this earlier stage of the language is word. I think there's some value in saying, there's this similar theme or motif or belief in one culture or another, kind of finding some common humanity there. But I don't think that seeking out a sort of Ur myth or Ur narrative or Ur religion is helpful, and that's kind of, it seems like a weird obsession in some corners of the internet. And I just don't think that that's there. I think that you have one set of traditions that develops here and one set of traditions that develop there, and where they're similar, it's because humans are similar, and where they're different, right? And where they're different, it's because maybe the environment is different, or just that culture developed in a particular different way. You have a more aggressive culture versus a more mercantile culture versus a more, religious in the sense of having some elaborate code kind of culture. I just don't know if looking for that like Ur mythos is all that useful. And I don't necessarily think that's what somebody like Campbell is doing, but I think it's sometimes what people interpret those writings as doing. Anyway, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I feel the need on that note to plug the book, The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. He's the fellow that does the Naked Bible podcast. And the whole premise of the book is that Christians often view the Bible through a particular modern cultural lens or a particular denominational lens, like through a Church of England lens or Pentecostal lens or something. But he's like, well, no, really, we should look at the Bible for, as it was written in its actual original context, social and cultural context, because that's the way that we best understand the meaning, instead of trying to impose our lens onto everything. So it instead of seeing like, oh, those connections and parallels with everything else, it's really good at stripping away the layers that we can impose on the original document. And this would be true for reading the Norse myths as well. When I read them, I keep thinking, Andrew, don't think like a 21st century Western man. Try to go Viking. So I go Viking mode, and then I read them. And that helps, because when I do that, the blood starts pumping, I feel really good. And also, I think, oh, these are spiritual texts, so they're not necessarily to be taken like an article in the newspaper or something. But they're using great spiritual cosmic things. And the Unseen Realm is really good for sort of desecularizing the Bible, to really help us see it as a cosmic, spiritual, supernatural document, and strip away the more secular layers that we can impose upon it.
And some comments following up on that. I think that an equivalent book for the Eddas, you wouldn't guess it from the title, but it's Judith Jesch's book, The Viking Diaspora, which I think is just a really excellent intro to actual Norse thought, especially pre-Christian Norse thought. She really gets into the head of the culture. Another is that you have to do the same thing with Norse myth, right? Stripping away a lot of these assumptions. I see so much of the commentary, especially you know on the internet and such, where people just assume certain things that are really just layers of modern speculation and sometimes early scholarship piled on top of the original sources. Like you get all this stuff about Tyr being a god of war, which is pure speculation
Yeah.
based on like his name, or him being earlier the chief god. Well, that's people speculate that because his name is cognate with Zeus, or that he's a war god because he's given Tuesday, which is also Mars Day, right? I mean, but if you actually look at him in the Eddas, he's there's not that much about him, but there's
Mm.
so much built up on top. And the same
Yeah.
thing happens with texts, right? When I was putting together the Wanderer's Havamal, so often you run into people who were trying to kind of like so many editions of Havamal basically take this notion that it's sort of this defective text that you have to reconstruct the original thing out of, right? Cleesby, not Cleesby, Gudbrandur Vigfusson, in his edition of it, turns it into like 5 different poems and rearranges all the stanzas. He and Finnur Jonsson archaize the language of it a lot. To me, I don't feel entitled to do that. I'm like, here's the text that we actually have.
Yes.
That's what I'm going to talk about, and
Yes.
it shows the marks of maybe having been transmitted from an earlier time than it was written down. Fine, I'm going to talk about those where I see them. I'm not going to. I don't feel entitled to talk about a reconstruction. I feel entitled to talk about what we have.
Yeah,
That's
and I wonder if sometimes some of the things that seem really bizarre in Norse myth, and you think, oh, that must be due to a Christian influence or
dun dun
something.
dun.
Da, da, da. Da, 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 da. But in fact, no, it's intentionally weird. I tell you what, there's some pretty weird stuff in the Bible. I tell you, it's quite bizarre. And you see, like the end of the Gospel of St. Mark is women running in the night in terror, silently, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. End of. That's the original ending of the Gospel. And a lot of people have said, oh, that can't have originally been the ending of the Gospel because that sounds just really weird. But we don't have any evidence that there was originally another ending to the gospel. Another one was written a bit later, but we don't have any evidence that there was an original one. And I think it's a pretty good ending, actually, and it says a lot. And it seems bizarre to our modern eyes, but I think it actually makes a lot of sense. So I suppose you can see that a lot in Norse writing as well.
Oh, sure. I mean, and actually, it ties into something from manuscript studies. We were talking about this, I remember, in the crowdcast with Kaylee Smith. We were talking about Sanskrit and the Vedas, where when you see something that's really hard to understand in an ancient text, that's probably the most legitimately ancient thing there. and and you are probably going to learn a lot more from trying to understand that than by trying to force it into something that you can understand.
Yeah.
Nero has added to his question that I was having a hard time following. So he says, I guess since money was so different in ancient culture, but then the Romans come along and start printing coinage, could that have had an influence on the Norse and their ideas of possessions or wealth? Well, I don't know if that has much to do with the Bible, but there is, yeah, some cultural influence from, I guess, the Romans, who would be the first Christians the Norse are encountering. I'm trying to remember the exact words, but one of the Roman words for a gold's coin is the source of the Norse word that becomes like the Swedish, Danish, Norwegian word öre, which is like cents, from dollars and cents. But I don't know that model of exchange and currency and such has much to do with Christianity, beyond the fact that Christianity and the Roman Empire both originated in a Mediterranean world that has a more developed notion of currency and trade than the more.
Uh-huh.
Would you add something to that? I don't know.
Oh, no, I can't think of anything to add.
I can't exactly myself. Um, Maggie says death comes into the world through transgression, according to Genesis. Is there a comparable explanation in Norse myths, or since the gods also die, is it just assumed to be part of the mechanics of the universe? It's an interesting thought. I would say that that's right. That death is just sort of there from the beginning, because even the gods have to eat special apples to keep from getting old and dying. So a sense then that there's this default that everything gets old and dies. In fact, you could argue, and this is probably, a 300-page article you could draw out of this. I think you could argue that something like Ragnarok is the culmination of the quote-unquote life cycle of the Earth itself, right? This
Yeah.
expectation that everything dies. I think that that's actually a really big difference from the Judeo-Christian conception. What would you say?
In that, in Norse writings, death is just an inevitable natural thing, whereas in the Bible, death is an alien, wrong thing.
Yeah,
To
that
me,
it's right.
like death, that the Lord never wants death. Yeah, the Book of Wisdom says something like that. Yeah, yes, I think that's right. I think that's right. One of the things I've really enjoyed from this book is it says that there's three major transgression events listed in Genesis. There's Adam and Eve,
Right.
and there's the Tower of Babel, which led to everyone being scattered around the world in different languages and torn apart from one another and turning from the one true God. And also the coming of the Nephilim, which is only referred to briefly in chapter 6 of Genesis, and that is rogue spiritual entities, angels rejecting God and coming down and sleeping with human women and creating this new great tribe of powerful bad entities, of which one ended up being Goliath with David. And so there's those three events of transgression. So that's human transgression and spiritual transgression. So the transgression is done by humans, and it's also done by spiritual entities, and that this has brought corruption into what is a default good world. The Christian understanding that everything is ultimately good, it just gets corrupted because of free will. People have free will, spiritual entities have free will, so people can make things bad, spiritual entities can make things bad. And yeah, yes, what was the thing about transgression? I've forgotten now.
So how death comes into the world through transgression in Genesis, but it doesn't in the Norse cosmos. To me, this connects a lot to what we were saying earlier, where there's such a different worldview, where the world is made for us in Judeo-Christian conception, but we're just sort of here in the Norse conception. I think
Yeah,
there's also like this sense that, because it was made for us and because God loves us, I don't think it would be that easy to say that any of the Norse gods loves us.
no,
That we, even if we physically die, there is some sense in which we don't. But you don't really get that from the Norse conception, where even the afterlife is tied to your physical body very directly, right? You don't hear about the spirit going to Valhalla or to hell. It is the person who goes to Valhalla or to hell. And in something like Helgi the Hundingsbana 2, where Helgi comes back to his grave mound, he has to go back and forth between the grave mound and Valhalla physically. There's not some part of us that survives the death of the body. The body
yes,
itself is the self.
yeah. Interestingly, in some parts of the Old Testament, you do get that sense that the body and the spirit do have a connection. So Jude in his letter mentions Archangel Michael and the devil fighting over the body of Moses. Why bother fighting over the body of Moses? Well, it's linked to that idea that his spirit is connected with the body. And in Matthew's gospel, when the Jesus dies on the cross, I think it says that the bodies of some of the saints arose out of their graves, and that like as a symbol of resurrection power coming to everyone, but it uses like they're coming out of their graves, their bodies, like they are their bodies. I suppose that's just an indication that I mean, I think you're completely right, Jackson, but I also think there is also a total connection with the spirit with the body as well in the Bible. I suppose it's that understanding that it's through the body that the spirit, the human spirit, comes into existence, and that they're not alien to one another, that there's that connection. And yeah, that the spirit is what lives on ultimately. Yeah. I suppose it just uses the body to tie in. It's saying that the body is not an anti-spiritual
Right.
thing.
But I think this is something that's often confused in Christian tradition itself. I mean, so to clarify, you look at, say, up to 19th earliest 20th century Christian writings, and there is a clear remembrance of the notion that the body is resurrected too. For example, that's why you want to find the body and bury the body whole. That's why you don't, molest or disturb or mock or damage bodies, because eventually the body's going to be resurrected too. I feel like somewhere in the 20th century, the sort of mainstream notion has actually changed, where people don't think about the body anymore, and they don't think of that as having anything to do with the with resurrection, right? So, for example, it's a huge part of the goal of my channel that no one even be able to know my own beliefs or whatever. But I
have no idea what your beliefs are at all.
but I'm certainly related to people who would never countenance cremation, because that destroys the body that's going to be resurrected. But I find that that's a very minority understanding now. That now it's like, yeah, cremate whatever, do whatever to the body, because it's only the soul. I feel like there is a little bit of that in older Christianity too, this notion that the soul survives where the body doesn't, because sometimes the body is lost, right? What happens to someone who's lost in the sea or burns up or, eaten whole by an animal or something like that? Something survives of that person. The soul has some endurance of its own. But as you said, the body is not anti-soul. Like, to me, that's something that's gotten muddled somewhere in the history of Christianity, maybe not fully resolved. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, I think you're quite right. But the scriptures are pretty clear that the body is. My understanding is the scriptures are clear that the body is not an anti-spirit thing. That it's as St. Paul talks about how your body is to be a temple of the Holy Spirit, no less. Your body is like a temple, a place in which the spiritual enters in. It comes to be. It's the means by which the energy that is your soul comes to be, and there's not that dividing line. But I think you're quite right that in modern day understanding that Christianity, often there's an idea that the body and the soul are pretty totally separate things. But that's not what I see in the scriptures, and like with burial practices mentioned in the Bible as well. What you do with the body is pretty important after death.
And I think about, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, with Christ saying, if your eye offends you, cut it out. If your hand offends you, cut it off. That's because the eye and the hand are part of the whole.
Yeah.
Right? It's that's pretty extreme language. And to me, it's pretty foreign from that same, I think, you know, pretty widespread modern Christian or post-Christian understanding of the soul and the body as opposed, because that's saying parts of the body might be opposed to the whole that is the soul and the body, right? There's not some simple soul-body curtain, but there's multiple curtains between the different parts of the self, which might be represented by physical parts of the self. I I just think this is probably wandering afield, but I just think that it's an interesting thing that I feel has changed in the history of Christian conceptions.
Yeah. Um, I suppose to tie it in with what we read in the Norse myths, I was thinking about the Norse gods in terms of, well, are they spirit or are they body? And they seem to me to be pretty physical
Yeah,
kind of guys and gals.
yeah,
And I was thinking, oh, it's not really quite like that in the Bible. But the Word was made flesh, and that's what's really important. And it's sort of like an ultimate expression of the sanctity of human existence and the human body that the Lord would become in human flesh. Oh, one thing I loved about this book is it talked about the word of God in the Old Testament, and it talks about how often in the Old Testament you hear the word of the Lord doing things. Like the word of the Lord comes to Samuel and stands there
mm,
next to Samuel, as in on legs. And also the angel of the Lord, it seems often that the angel of the Lord is a physical human embodiment of God. Like there's an angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord was in the burning bush, for
mm,
instance. Why? What was the angel of the Lord doing in the burning bush? Well, it
right,
seems like there was the Lord, God, making himself in physical, embodied form. This was with Samson's parents as well, many instances. So the incarnation of Jesus is a culmination of God making himself present and accessible through coming in human form, which is what the Norse gods do. They turn up, well, like Odin, they turn up as looking like people. Except for the Norse, I think Odin doesn't, he's always like a human.
yeah.
He
Well,
doesn't say he's,
and he's not omnipresent, he's not omniscient, and he's not omnipotent. So you can hide from Odin, I guess. I mean, I suppose if you read Genesis a certain way, you can hide from Christian God too. But uh, Odin has to go to a particular place to see all the realms, and other gods like Freyr in the story of Forskirnis has to go to that same place, Odin's throne, to see all the different realms. Odin is in one place at a time, and when he changes form, it is his whole form, right? It says that or or that he somehow sort of possesses things. The way Snorri talks about his magic of changing shape in Ynglinga Saga makes it sound like maybe he leaves his default body kind of asleep while he goes abroad in the form of an animal. But in order to learn things, he has to send out his ravens, right? There's not this sense that I can perhaps just at any moment say pray to Odin and be heard. I have to
yeah.
go through the right motions to attract his attention, right? Probably make the proper sacrifice to get his attention. I think that's a pretty different conception right there. Yeah, that's interesting. Just thinking about the different sort of physicalities.
And when you think about how an ancient Norse person might have thought, he might have thought, wow, or he or she might have thought, wow, this God of Israel sounds pretty amazing. I'm really impressed. I think I'll start worshipping. I suppose it's hard for us to, because we're so surrounded by Christian influence, it's hard to think
Da,
of
da, da.
people not being able to think of an omniscient God and to think of the limitations on Odin. The Archangel Gabriel says to Mary, nothing is impossible for God. Well, that's not true for Thor or Odin. There's plenty
True,
of things that are impossible for them. So,
true. They can't prevent their own deaths. Yeah,
no.
that's true. Which, of course, it's a different conception of godhood, I think we forget how revolutionary
Yeah.
the Jewish conception of God is. It is so different from the
Yeah.
more limited. It's not just that
Yeah.
there's one God. It's that there's one God who can, in principle, do anything, which is
Yeah.
really, really different from the more. I won't say more limited. I'll take a chance on a different word and say more characterized polytheistic gods, where there's a kind of a menu of things they can do. That's I think that's here we've actually hit on a really big difference.
Yeah, and like the ancient Jewish and Christian people were able to say, and we have supporting evidence because we can see that when we reject the Lord, we go into exile. We can see that when we are faithful, the Lord is faithful to us, and He gives us a promised land, and He leads us through the Red Sea, and He leads us to have a temple in Jerusalem, and we can see that He is spreading forth His power through David and Solomon. We can see that God is actually active in the world for us. We have all this supportive evidence in the events of our lives and our nation and what happens. Whereas for the Norse, I don't think there's a lot where they can say, "Oh, our great powerful gods have brought about this for us or that for us." There's a bit of it in that, in the Norse myths they say, "Oh, well, if it wasn't for Thor, there wouldn't be a human being left
Right.
in Midgard because all the Jotuns would have killed us all, the giants would have killed us all." But so I suppose they've got that understanding that, oh, well, we're safe because of Thor, but I'm not sure that they're able to have this detect a narrative going over centuries of historical events where they are saying, "Oh, this happened, the exile happened
Yeah.
because of our relationship with God, and then we came back from exile because we turned to the Lord." I don't see
Yeah.
that course of human history being played out so much in Norse myths. I mean, you can say, "Oh, we survived the winter because," and here's a myth about like Skirner's journey, where it's a myth about winter ending and life coming to be, and that expresses that we've come through winter into spring, and that is because of Freud. And this myth, this narrative is like a poetic expression of what he's done for it. I suppose they've got that, so they've got a limited bit of it.
Well, I think maybe a finer grain way of putting it is that the gods interact quite a bit in the personal histories of the heroes, but most of us are not heroes, right?
Yeah,
You can look at places in the saga of the Volsungs and say this happened because Odin made this happen.
yeah, yeah.
But in the history of the kings of Norway, there's not that many places where you can look and say, well, this happened because Odin made this happen. Maybe, the right sacrifices were made, so you got a good omen or something like that, but it's much more limited. Not that same sense of the guiding hand of divine destiny. After all, it seems like our destinies, our inevitable death days, are set by the Norns, who aren't, as far as we can tell, worshipped figures. They're very neutral figures that even the gods are subject to the decrees of.
Yeah, I don't want my life determined by a Norn. Who organised that a Norn has control? Who are they?
That's very shadowy. It's very
Wow.
hard to tell who they are. Um, Chris has a question that let's see. I'm struck by the pacifist aspect of Christianity and love thy neighbor does not seem to have any impact on Snorri's depiction of the actions of Norse Christians. What is going on here? I thought thou shalt not kill was a pretty basic part of Christianity. So
It
I
is.
think
There's a lot of killing in the Bible.
there's a lot of killing.
A lot of killing.
I think this is another one of those places where it's like, A, humans are the same everywhere and humans kill each other. B, I think actually one thing that really strikes me about the historical interaction of people converting and such is that cultures don't change very much even when the religion changes. Most people, it is my impression, in my long years on the earth, act as they do without reference to an explicitly stated ideology, though they have an explicitly stated ideology, it is not necessarily that concordant with what they do, right? A lot of people are very content to just say, don't kill, but, kill for this reason or that reason, kill in war being perhaps the easiest one to excuse, kill in self-defense. This case is on the edges. People make their exceptions. And I know a whole lot more people. Here's the real core of what I'm rambling toward. I know a ton more people who are angry to be called a liar, who don't think twice about lying. Right? They have a stated ideological opposition to this thing, lying, but in terms of how they actually live their lives, whatever. So I think that there's a lot of that in terms of people being converted to an explicitly ideological religion like Christianity that maybe has rules like don't kill, don't steal. For one thing, early on in the conversion, people may not even know about those rules. Right? They've been told, don't pray to Thor, pray to Christ. So, okay, they've changed that. But it's not like the Bible's been translated into Norse. They may not have even really heard a sermon.
Yeah, yeah.
And on the other hand, too, I mean, it's not like cultural inertia changes. People do things because that's how the people around them are doing. Again, drawing on nameless relatives, I certainly know people who have never read the Bible, only know it from excerpts heard now and then in church, but will call themselves biblical literalist Christians. Because, as far as they're concerned, the Bible is an instruction manual on how to be a good person. I'm a good person, so that's an instruction manual on how to be like me. Right?
Without even reading the Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not that the ideology comes first and you are trying to conform yourself to the ideology. It's that there's an ideology in there and you assume that it conforms to what you do anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I suppose because there's so much killing in the Bible. I mean, Jesus said, well, those who live by the sword die by the sword. And Jesus wasn't charging around stabbing people. But there is a lot of killing in the Bible. And I view all that like what Joshua does when he enters the Promised Land and goes into battle against the descendants of the Nephilim and everything. I view that as a great image of this great cosmic war going on between the light and the darkness. And Jesus continues what Joshua would. Jesus is the Greek form of the word Joshua, so it's the new and ultimate Joshua. He continues that work, casting out powers of darkness and building up a new Israel, like a renewed Israel, like Joshua did. He doesn't do it through stabbing people. There's a lot of that battle imagery for the Lord and for people like David in the Bible, but it works as imagery of this great battle between goodness and evil, light and darkness. And Jesus continues in that warrior form, fighting the darkness, and he shows that it's not done by killing people. Well, possibly some of the Old Norse might not have wanted to really grasp that concept and have been more like, oh, well, let's just, be like Joshua and go stab people. Well, hey.
Well, and he says, I come with a sword, right? And he talks about setting family members against one another, and
there's a fire blazing on the earth. Yeah.
And of course, you look in northern Germany, when that part of the world is being converted, very similar culture and language to the Norse. And the early 700s, you have the poem "The Heliond," right, which is about. It's basically the Gospels put together into a concordance and then turned into Beowulf, right?
Oh, really? Yeah. How do you spell that?
Hold on, I'll show it to you.
I'm gonna read it. Oh, brilliant!
So
thank you.
Yeah, so this is the edition by James Cathy. So it takes Jesus' life and it puts it in terms that an early German tribesmen can understand, right?
Yeah.
It makes the conflicts much more physical. It changes the physical environment from desert to forest, right? Jesus becomes, the I remember the terms in Old English, which is a close language, but he's Thrichten, right, with his warriors, his thanes like
Yeah.
Beowulf, right? It's
Yeah.
all rephrased in this different cultural understanding, and it also works in all these things to kind of explain things that are weird uh, to these early Germans, like when the angel says, to call the baby John. Some neighbors like, why not call him Frithger or something normal like that? It's like, well, he needs to be called this because it means this and this, or
Uh,
or justifying things like, Mary was a virgin, and among her people this was considered important before, like all these things that are kind of like clarifying at the edges things that might be harder to understand for someone in that cultural context. It's really really interesting.
it
Um,
sounds like Lord of the Rings. I heard again on Naked by podcast a big thing about Aragorn in Lord of the Rings being an image of Jesus, who enters into his kingship through battling with the powers of darkness, and this sense that the Lord of the Rings has these Norse mythological images infused with Christian imagery. That Helion sounds like that a bit.
yeah, it's pretty crazy. I mean, it's it's the Gospels, but it's not. it's
Yeah.
it just completely culturally translates it.
Oh, I'll totally look it up.
So
Cheers.
so this book that I've got is the old. So the language is called Old Saxon. This gets confused with Old English, but it's the language of Northern Germany in the early Middle Ages. So it's from Germany, not from England. This is the Old Saxon original text. There are modern English translations. I think there might even be one by Kathy. By the way, though, if anyone can read Old English, you can read Old Saxon just fine. It's very readable. Um, we've taken about an hour and a half of your time. We've gone pretty long. We've had a great conversation here. Does anybody have maybe some closing questions, remarks? Do you have some closing remarks you'd like to make?
Me closing remarks I'd like to make. Um, oh, yeah. Well, thanks for having me. It's absolutely,
Of course,
absolutely brilliant. So it is.
this has
Um,
been great for, I think, really. I feel like so many of you hear about comparing and contrasting two religions or two bodies of lore, and I feel like people make the same points again and again. This little story is a lot like this little story. I think part of what's, especially what you've done here, is illuminate much deeper similarities in the human condition and much deeper differences in the way that these religions conceive
yeah.
of the concept of God or gods.
Yeah, and I suppose it emphasizes how we think now is not going to last forever. The way our society operates now and views
Yeah.
things now isn't going to last forever. It's going to radically change as well. And the way in which people who come after us will view the ancient texts will change as well. And so the really important thing is for all people to try to strip away the modern viewpoints and try to get back to the original way of viewing thing, which is not going to be the same at all across ancient cultures and peoples.
Yeah, I think that's part of why it's so important to have these texts. Sounds like a plug. It was like I've been winding up to a commercial, but to have these texts in language people understand, because in not being distant from the language, we can have a clearer conception of the meaning, and maybe without having to dig through, as obscure of language, you can get a better sense of how people think about things quite differently at another time without just writing it off as like, yeah, this is in a weird older stage of, like the sort of King James English.
Yeah,
Um, I think that allows you to be simultaneously more distant from it and uh, and not understand how different it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, because when I read your translations, it's just like you're hearing a human. You're not
Oh,
hearing Shakespeare. You're hearing a normal human talking, not in overly elaborate language. And so you're hearing that person, and you're hearing that person in all the bald weirdness. You can't put any of the weirdness of what they're saying down to the intricate language.
yeah,
It's simple language, and it really shows how bizarre it is.
right.
I think
And I,
it's so helpful, yeah.
and I think it's important. Although I'm a hypocrite because I still cite the Bible and the KJV because it's just what I'm used to. Um, Anders did ask one question here. Can you tell us how this crowdcast came to happen? Where did you connect first? Actually, on Patreon. Andrew's a longtime Patreon supporter himself, and thank you, by the way, for that. And we've just chatted over the years about this, that, and the other, and this idea kind of came to us a couple months ago and seemed like a good crowdcast. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you everybody for coming. And we'll be in touch.
Yeah. Cheers very much.
All right. All the best,
Good
everyone.
night. Yeah. Cheers. Bye bye.